Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're very pleased today to have another interview as part of the AI and COVID-19 Disinformation Initiative. It's an initiative supported by the OSCE's Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, in which we're talking about the intersection of disinformation, particularly around the COVID crisis, the use of AI to deal with COVID disinformation, and what the wider implications are for freedom of expression, it's a key fundamental human right that we enjoy in democracy. So today, I'm very pleased to have with us Alice Stollmeyer. Alice is the founder and executive director of Defend Democracy, an important think tank working in Brussels and the capital of the European Union to deal with digital disinformation and the threats to democracy. So Alice, great to have you on.
Good to be here. Thanks, Kyle.
So Alice, maybe we'll start. Tell us a bit about your work on disinformation. Tell us about some of the things that you're working on now, and just we'll then go into some deeper questions related to AI and freedom of expression.
Sure. Well, I think it's good to know that my background with disinformation is not as an academic nor as a policy maker, but really more as a practitioner. I used to work as a digital strategist on European energy and climate policies. And in that capacity, I would say from around 2014, I was encountering the first trolls and then later bots. And that's kind of when my curiosity started, like, what's going on here? Why is Twitter changing? Who's behind these accounts? And so on. And I think it also played a role in why I founded Defend Democracy a few years later. And now as Defend Democracy, one of the many things we do is to try to fight disinformation, but not by publishing academic reports or policy advice, which are mostly published months after the particular disinformation campaign took place, for example, after an election or after some sort of geopolitical crisis. But what we try to do is to monitor, analyze, and expose disinformation campaign. And this is not like a singular lie, but really about organized campaigns. So we try to monitor, analyze, and expose them in real time. And the idea is twofold, that on the one hand, you try to nip any potential effects in the bud, so to decrease any potential harmful effects. And on the other hand, you try to, by your communication, you try to raise awareness and to increase digital literacy of the population. And more specifically, one project we are currently working on is the Dutch general elections, which will take on the 17th of March this year.
So, Alice, you've covered general disinformation, and I like how you talk about dealing with it as it's happening rather than long after the fact. I think we need to be moving in that direction on so many other issues. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about, from your experience, how are you seeing any changes in online digital disinformation in relation to the COVID crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, some of the trends that I was seeing for a while have accelerated, and some of my fears and expectations have materialized sooner than I had hoped they would be. Yeah, and this was really, I think it was not just the pandemic, but it was a big contribution to it. I mean, there were other developments too, but definitely the pandemic is part of it. And so what's important to realize, I think, that digitization has both opportunities and risks for our democracies. Like, for example, this year's elections, and that's not just the Dutch ones, but other ones too, will be more digital than ever before. And that's not just because we have started to use social media even more over the past couple of years, but also because the pandemic is forcing us to live our lives even more online than before. And this confluence of events presents our democracies not only with opportunities, but also with risks. Like, since the outbreak of the pandemic, both disinformation and conspiracy theories have spread more rapidly from the margins of the internet to the mainstream media, and thereby gaining greater reach than before.
So as this, and I think you're right, we're online more, we're dependent on this technology. It's kind of hard to see us turning back from it. But in order,
I often like to think about, sorry to interrupt, but
no problem.
It's really, I can't remember who said it or where I read it, but really our phones, and not just our phones, but they are like a tech service. We really need to look at it that way. And it's incredible to realize that we're carrying this tech service with us, like almost 24/7.
No, I think that's a very interesting point, and we see some of the COVID conspiracies that that the vaccine is going to track us and follow us around while everyone has a smartphone in their back pocket where they're being tracked, whether they know it or not.
Exactly.
It is quite crazy.
We don't need chips in our brains. We have it in our hands, or even in our ears.
I agree with you 100%. Alice, so dealing with the disinformation online, I'm wondering, getting to the issue of artificial intelligence, we know the role of algorithms on social media platforms, the use of deep fake technology to change videos. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's coming upon us, but I'm wondering, just to get into a discussion about the role of AI, does AI play a role in enabling disinformation online? Do you see this in any of your work?
Well, definitely. And you already mentioned algorithms. And frankly, I think that's a hugely important part. So for those that may not know, digital platforms use algorithms to rank not just posts, but also accounts in our timelines, in trending topics, in group recommendations, in video recommendations, etc., etc. And and this is really, really key, since almost all digital platforms have polarization as their business model, the role of these algorithms, and so AI, is huge in pushing disinformation and divisive content. And then, I'm not even speaking about the doctored profile pictures and the deep fakes, because frankly, sometimes I get, and let me be Dutch and direct, sometimes I have the impression that some of the bigger, and perhaps even the smaller, some tech firms, they think that deepfakes are super interesting, and of course, I mean, there's probably money to be made with it, to try to tackle them or whatever. But there's so much shallow fakes out there already doing damage that we don't even need deep fakes. The shallow fakes are a problem in itself. And I feel very, very strongly about polarization being, and I'm very straightforward. Polarization is most platforms' business model. And so, yes, of course, there are also foreign actors, not only because there's also domestic actors pushing disinformation, but, if it wouldn't be for polarization as a business model, the problem would be very different. And so I think it's important to somehow break that business model, and whether that's by, there's several options. I don't know which is the best one. There may have been some studies done already, but I don't know, like there could be a public service alternative to one or more platforms, perhaps even to the entire internet, without algorithms, or at least some sort of algorithms that are shaped in such a way that at least they are not pushing polarization and hate speech and disinformation, and that to have more healthy algorithms. I'm not saying that algorithms in themselves are necessarily bad, but they are if clicks are driving your business model, and what do you need to get more clicks? That's anything that appeals to people's emotions. So the more polarizing the content is, the more clicks you get, and that's just not healthy.
So I find it interesting how you the role of algorithms and platform governance. That's an issue to be looked at, I think, by governments, and also the proposal about some kind of public social media platform that doesn't have those, so it can so it doesn't have as polarizing effect. But I'm wondering, one of the challenges in dealing with disinformation and either the algorithms taking off, offensive statements or false statements, it's the idea that we have to protect freedom of expression. That's a fundamental human right. I'm wondering, in your views, what is the role of governments in trying to counter disinformation, but also safeguard freedom of expression? Because it's very often they're linked. So are there best examples from Europe? Is there legislation that we're seeing come out that should be on the minds of people that are concerned about this in other parts of the world, or in other OSCE member countries, or in North America? What should governments be doing in this space?
Well, that's a really good question. I know that freedom of speech often comes up in these conversations, and rightly so. I mean, protecting freedom of speech is important. However, it's also important to realize what exactly threatens the freedom of speech. So, for example, what I often do is there is a need to clearly distinguish two separate threats to democracy. One is the information disorder, which is caused by the broken incentive structure of our online environment, combined with humans' innate psychological vulnerabilities. And secondly, the authoritarian political warfare, which goes far beyond disinformation. Now, both are threats to democracy, and both must be addressed, but they each need to be tackled in very different ways. Now, the information disorder needs the whole range of resilience measures, like civil society, digital literacy, independent media, regulation of platforms, humane technology, etc. However, acts of hybrid war require deterrence, imposing costs on malicious or criminal behavior. And anything less would mean to fail precisely citizen security and democracy and other fundamental freedoms and rights. So, for example, a sanctions regime that does not equal a blanket ban on untruth, and as such does not threaten an individual citizen's freedom of expression. On the contrary, and here comes the important point, imposing costs to malign disinformation and influence campaigns is necessary to ensure the freedom of speech of individual, genuine citizens. Because there's so much an overload of information and misinformation and disinformation that, like, the right, people's right to which are in the Charter of Fundamental Rights to information. And I can't remember how exactly it is formulated in the Charter, but we have a right to a public space and to information. And when that public space is overwhelmed by too much information, and some of that information and especially the mis and disinformation is amplified artificially, then precisely the freedom of information and expression of real citizens, not the bots and the trolls, is in danger. So we really need to, every time when freedom of expression comes up as an argument not to regulate anything, no, we have to flip it around.
That's a fascinating point, Alice, and I think people don't really give a lot of thought to this, but as these platforms have become almost like the Wild West, where there are bots and trolls and armies that are going after people, and we've seen journalists being kind of targeted, harassed online, but also individual citizens, and that experience,
and judges. And medical experts. I mean, this is what happens in the pandemic. There are doctors out there who, besides needing to fight for lives, need to waste energy and time to counter disinformation online. That's ridiculous. They shouldn't be. I mean, they are needed to save people's lives, not to fight lies.
But there's also one of the negative impacts of this, of people attacking other real people online, is that very often they will remove themselves from these platforms because it becomes a very negative social reaction. And then they're deprived of their freedom of expression because they don't feel that they can express themselves. So it really is a nasty situation that we're seeing develop.
Yep, I fully agree.
So Alice, maybe my last question, you've answered everything in great detail and given us a lot to think about. I'm wondering, have you seen anything in the disinformation landscape? Have you seen any positive things that any of the tech platforms have done that might not be well known to people or could be duplicated in other platforms? Is there anything you're seeing on, like, is it fact checking? I'm just wondering if there's anything that jumps out at you.
Well, I do like, for example, what some platforms are trying to do, which is kind of design speed bumps, which are, for example, well, let's use Twitter as an example. So if there is a tweet, say, that is I mean, that is fact-checked and that is incorrect, and for example is about elections, and you know, it gets like this label, like this statement or this information is disputed, and in some cases it's even, they even put like an extra yeah, speed bump is the best, still the best word I've heard for it, which means that if you try to retweet it, it won't work, because to help ensure that it gets less and not more visibility, they have reduced the types of engagement that are possible with this particular tweet. So you can, for example, no longer reply, because that generates a lot of visibility, even though you may not realize, but that kind of puts it in other people's timelines, even though that may not have been your intent. Or you can no longer retweet. Often they still do allow that you do a so-called quote retweet, so that you can add your own comment or context. So this, I'm not recommending that necessarily, the latter one, but because it's, even a quote retweet is still a retweet, so beware, you're still retweeting disinformation in that case. But I think that's a fascinating example of such a, yeah, putting up a speed bump for for the spread of dis and misinformation.
Well, Alice, I want to thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule, sharing your expert knowledge and the work that you're doing to defend democracy and what you're seeing in the European context. It's very valuable to people from all countries that are part of the OSCE that are trying to deal with disinformation and also safeguard freedom of expression. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Kyle. Good to see you again.